Okay. Yeah, a little more. Alrighty, let's jump in here. All right, so on the agenda for today is trying to finish off talking about secularization. And we got basically 2, 3-ish kind of theories of secularization left to talk about. A couple of them are really quick. They're a single slide. I had added a couple slides at the end of this slideshow, so if for whatever reason we get to there and you're missing those slides, just go and re-download the slides from eClass, because I had forgotten to add self-limiting secularization and post-secularization in my initial run-through, and I added them a little bit later. But we'll see how we do, because I'd really like to start on the rise of Christianity sooner rather than later. Okay. Sorry, so last time we ended off basically here, right? We're talking about Stark and his sort of no secularization theory, where he's essentially claiming that, all this talk being bandied about for the last 3 or 4 centuries, that modernity and religion are inexorably kind of at each other's throats, and that as we get more modern, we will also get more secular, he thinks is a bunch of hooey, to put it academically. And we've gone through this kind of evidence, right, of his view that this theory failed because Europe, which is the key kind of example for secularization theory, right? Because as Europe got more modern, it got less religious. That's the typical story. And he says, poppycock. What a bunch of foolishness. Only sociologists could be so foolish. That's not the truth, right? Europe, he says, was never that religious, and he pulls out a whole bunch of historical evidence pointing in that direction. Then he kind of, goes through a few other things, right? He doesn't think that scientists, who should be the most secular, right, if scientific rationality and modernization, are dragging the gods into oblivion, scientists should be the least religious. But as of, this study done in the late 90s, they were no more or less religious than they'd been at the beginning of the 20th century. And then kind of does a bit of an around the world tour in his book, The Triumph of Faith, looking at the fact that, for a world that's modernizing, where we theoretically should see, secularization growing, we actually seem to be seeing, in some cases, the opposite effect, right? Japan, the kind of case study for modernity and secularism going hand in hand, he says, is actually suffused with religious understanding. Just it's unchurched compared to churched. And then, we're here on, he talks about China, kind of once the communists kind of release their grip on religion a little bit in China becoming much more religious across a range of religions, Christianity, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and Chinese folk religions, all growing. And then, we ended off talking about India and the fact that, while the kind of initial expectations of the Indian leaders after, the end of the colonial period was that as India industrialized or modernized, basically, it would get less religious. We've actually seen quite the opposite, right? Hinduism has seen a massive revival in India with more people, expressing more intense kind of beliefs, visiting shrines more often, and, basically kind of growing religiosity, right? So a survey conducted in 2007 found that a third of Indians reported becoming more religious in the past 5 years, but only a 5% said they reported becoming less religious. And yeah, I mean, we also see a sharp rise in religious conflicts between Hindus and other minorities, especially Muslims and Christians, although Sikhs as well. Sikhs have had a fraught relationship with Hindus, and as Hindu nationalism has really surged, relationships in India between Hindus and Sikhs has gotten worse in a lot of cases. And I mean, this is all prior to Narendra Modi, the current Prime Minister of India, taking power, and he is famously a Hindu nationalist. Okay, interesting kind of things here. A bunch of data that he takes, again, from World Values Survey, the 2006 edition, from India, right? And he looks at income and religiosity in India. Now, why is he looking at this, right? Because I think one of the fundamental assumptions of a lot of secularization theory is also this kind of deprivation-y type theory of like a quasi-Marxist understanding in some ways, that religion is really helpful for the poor, right? But is actually not that helpful for the wealthy, right? And so as people get richer, they will get less religious. I see your question. I'll answer it in a sec. And basically what we see, right, is, in terms of our economic classes, what Stark is going to see here is that as people get richer, they're actually more likely to say that prayer, that they pray and that religion is very important to them. Yeah, please.
Is that data from specifically India?
Yeah. Yeah, that's specifically Indian data.
Because doesn't that feed into the idea of the Hinduism, the caste system, like how, if you're higher up in social status, you would be, essentially better off in terms of reincarnation and stuff, unfortunately being a guru? Wouldn't that kind of play a role in the data?
Interesting. I hadn't considered that. Let me just think about that for a sec. I mean, you would have to then make a case that somehow, people who are poor in India don't believe in any of the same things, right? That they wouldn't be, trying to, say, escape that cycle of rebirth in different ways. I don't know that the data here kind of pans that out, right? Certainly, people who are wealthy would probably think that they'd done something better in another life. One of the things that Stark would kind of note, and I was going to say this, and then you asked the question. It's a really good question. One of the things we know in general, actually, and this comes up in the rise of Christianity, is that, well, we have this notion brought to us from Marx that religion is fundamentally for the poor. Historically, that actually doesn't seem to be as much the case as you would think. And one of the things that Stark will note, and he notes this in all sorts of places, so I think it's in The Rise of Christianity, but I know he said it in other places as well, is that, well, virtually all new religious movements actually emerge not from the poor, but actually from the middle and upper classes, right? That actually, one of the things that seems to be true is that there is a certain amount, okay, and I'll say this is absolutely 100% true, and I've just been looking at data to this effect. Like in the United States today, right, the people who are most likely to be religious is, people with income above $100,000 and people with, and in terms of like religious service attendance frequently, it's a graduate degree or better, right? Much more so than people who have a high school degree or less are much more likely to be religious. And Stark's basic explanation for this is that, in a sense, you have to have enough, like, to really consider religious ideas, right? You really have to have a certain degree of leisure in your life, right? Like, you have to be not worried all the time about feeding yourself and housing yourself. Once you have basic needs met, then you can sort of fundamentally get involved in more religion, right? So that actually, as wealth increases, people become slightly more religious. Why? Well, because they have the time to think about about supernatural things, right? Like, if you're just trying to get enough food so you don't starve to death, it's going to be pretty hard for you to spend a lot of time thinking about religious questions. And I think that's more what's going on here than maybe what you said, though it's an interesting kind of proposition, and I hadn't thought of it in that way. But yeah, I mean, so I'll just say really quickly, and I'm spoiling stuff from later on in the course, but that's okay. One of the things that Stark will say is that if we look at where religions and new religious movements, or even like religious sects sort of pop up, it's almost always out of, the middle or upper classes, right? So like Buddha, like the Buddha was a prince, right? He was not a poor man. Who else can we point to? Francis of Assisi, right? Francis of Assisi, who founds the Franciscans and fundamentally transforms Catholicism in major ways. He's a nobleman, right? The Wesley brothers, who found Methodism, are students at Oxford when they found Methodism, right? So there does seem to be, and I mean, okay, and here, I don't think this is in The Rise of Christianity. I know he talks about it in other places. Stark fundamentally sort of rejects the notion that Jesus was poor as well. And it might be because this is his sort of idea of who founds religions. But he thinks, it's pretty clear that Jesus was literate, right? And in that society, that would have been kind of a middle upper class sort of thing. And that most, rabbis didn't emerge from like the lower classes, but actually came from kind of educated middle and upper classes that had time to, say, study the Torah. Again, that's a little bit of revisionism, and that's Stark doing his Starky thing, which I love. But yeah, sorry, that's a really long and semi-incoherent answer to your very clear and pointed question. But I think, I think this is borne out even by contemporary data, is religion to some extent is a bit of a luxury product, right? Much more likely to be deeply embraced by those who have time to do so. And certainly people with lower incomes, with less education, because they're likely to have less time to spend being religious, are actually less likely to be religious. And again, the data on like the United States and who actually goes to church, like the working class is now almost completely absent from religion. It's become very much the domain of the middle and upper classes, which I think is an interest. It's kind of counterintuitive, but I think it's because we've been so conditioned by Karl Marx to say like, well, religion is for the poor because it makes their lives better. But you need time to think about religion. And I think Stark is kind of right about this. And I think it's borne out by a lot of data that's not gathered by Stark as well. But again, I'm a big fan, so maybe I'm just seeing in Stark, or in the data, what Stark wants me to see. I swear I don't have a shrine to Rodney Stark in my house, but I do love him. Okay. All right, so I think this is almost it for Stark. I'll answer that in a sec. I'll do this one. Okay. Percentage who attend church weekly in the United States, right? According to World Values Survey, right? One of the things that Stark notes is, well, we have this notion that America is getting much less religious. One of the things that you'll see, in this World Values data is that, so they've combined once a week, more than once a week, and about weekly, which is a weird way to ask that question, but whatever. Into this, and you'll see that basically between 1974 and 2014, really no significant change in weekly attendance rates in the United States in church, right? So that, one of the other things Stark is saying is that, we have this narrative that's been going on now of the nuns and secularization of America, but in a lot of ways, if you look at the data this way, the amount of people that were going to church in the 70s is about the same on a weekly basis, is about the same as it was, it's the same in 2014 as it was in 1974. So not a big difference, right? It's minor variations, it goes up and down, but within a range, kind of between what's the low 29 and 37 at the top end. And that's all margin of error kind of, you can kind of fit all that into the margin of error. Okay. I don't know. Okay. Is it possible that India is becoming more religious, not because religion has become more popular, but because their population is growing? I mean, we're still talking about, so I think if we talk about like visits to shrines, yes, right? In terms of like, if you're measuring like visits to shrines, yeah, India has become much more populous, although that growth has slowed down considerably in the last like 15 years, still growing, but much slower. But like all sorts of measures of religious intensity, like prayer, belief, things like, would you feel uncomfortable living next to a neighbor that's a different religion than yours? All of those have been rising. And there's been a very fervent Hindu nationalism, right, that very deeply connects India with Hinduism. So the religious intensity of Indians, regardless of the population size, does seem to be growing, and I think that's fairly indisputable. Is it true that lower we could be less religious, the frustrations in life and not believing in God? I think that's probably a little bit too simplistic. But it's not a bad explanation. I think it's more likely been caused by a whole bunch of cultural trends, right? And one in particular is, and here's where I think Stark would be right, and I think others like Glenn Stanton and Philip Jenkins are probably right, that in a lot of cases, the working class and the poor were always less religious, right? And that fundamentally, actually nothing has really changed there. But we'll talk about this when we talk about the nuns, and I think it's an interesting argument, that they've ceased identifying because the cultural pressure to identify has declined. Yeah, Jessica.
Out of curiosity, are some religions better suited for different classes? Some that follow the Marx theory that they are aimed for a poor demographic, while others are aimed for a wealthier demographic, and it's just
I know what you mean, and I'm already considering the answer to your question as you're speaking. So there do tend to be trends a little bit. I think here, sorry, I'm locked into kind of American data because I love how much data America generates, and it's always really fun. One of the things that you kind of see, actually, you know what? Let's do Brazil. Let's do Brazil and Latin America. Brazil and Latin America is a really interesting case for this. One of the things that happened in kind of Latin America was Catholicism, which was dominant on the continent, but not very practiced, right? Has become almost, especially say somewhere in Brazil, has become the purview of almost the middle and upper classes that remain really strongly tied with all the institutional forms of Catholicism and therefore hard to shift off of it. But what happened kind of starting in the 1970s is that a form of Protestantism called Pentecostalism, which is very emotionally expressive, lots of rock music, things like faith healing and all that stuff kind of goes into forms of Pentecostalism, though there's a range of what Pentecostals do, really picked up amongst the kind of lower middle class and working classes in Brazil, right? And it seems to speak, in a sense, more to their sensibilities. And also, and Stark makes this argument somewhere. I've read so many of his books, I can't remember which one now. That what happened with like the Pentecostals in Latin America is they started to be really, actually, no, I'm wrong. That's in Jenkins's book, The Next Christendom. And I remember. It's actually not Stark, it's Stark's buddy. Is that Pentecostalism was better attuned to offering a bunch of benefits to, in particular, women who joined. And so it grew really rapidly in the kind of middle, like lower middle and kind of working class Latin Americans. Particularly things like, it tended to have really strong family values and kind of battle against Latin American machismo. So like women who would often find themselves, married to a man who had a couple of mistresses on the side. The Pentecostals sort of protected against that. So a lot of women joined these churches, found husbands, and had kind of better lives out of it. And because that was more present in kind of the working and lower middle classes, it grew really quickly, right? Started with women, and then they brought in a whole bunch of men along with them and their families. And so like in terms of practiced religion, Pentecostalism is probably more practiced in Brazil today amongst that kind of, bulk that's kind of in the lower middle than Catholicism is, even though, most people who are upper class will say, yes, I'm Catholic, but their actual kind of religious intensity is a lot lower. Sorry, I know you guys ask really good questions. It's really hard to keep up with you sometimes, but it's a really interesting question. So yeah, I think what'll happen typically is like, if you have a kind of religious free market, which Brazil became once the government sort of stepped away from official Catholicism, you'll have particular religious movements that move into spaces, right? And so if there's a kind of gap in the market where maybe the the poor aren't being served, a religion can theoretically kind of move into that space.
Like right time, right place.
Essentially, yeah. And the conditions have to be right. And there has to be a religious innovator that sort of sees this gap and kind of comes in to fill it. Pentecostalism just happened to be kind of catching cultural fire at that particular moment. It's also made major inroads in Africa for some different reasons, similar and also different reasons. But we could, oh my gosh. I mean, here you have to come and take a different class with me, which is CHRTC 203, the Sociology of Christianity, where I do my round the world tour of kind of Christianity. In the data for Hinduism, does it also count its branches like Jainism? I'd have to check. I'm assuming so, but I'd have to go back and look at the World Values Survey data because I don't remember off the top of my head. Okay. Those are great questions. All right. So, last of the three big secularization theories. Then we got two small ones. I trust you'll have no difficult or involved questions in this section. Okay, so let me go back. So what we'll look at here is what's called the revised model of secularization, right? So this principally comes, there's a whole bunch of scholars that have worked on this. The one that I kind of highlight here is Marc Chavez, who I believe is at Notre Dame. And basically, one of the things that they're trying to do, and you hear it in the, Secularization, Rest in Peace piece by Stark, where he's like, quit moving the goalposts, guys. Just admit that secularization has been beaten. That little comment where he's like, people just move the goalposts is aimed at Chavez and these revised secularization scholars, right? Because, basically what Chavez and a bunch of other people do is say, okay, I think we maybe got secularization wrong. We still think that secularization is happening, right? But it probably looks different than a total absence of religious faith in a society. So that Peter Berger kind of argument, right, that, by the 2000s, there'd be like a few religious communities in the Himalayas somewhere hiding from modernity, that was wrong. And so, but they're like, but there's still something clearly going on, right? The role of religion in society has changed fundamentally. And we think, that should be called secularization, but we need to rethink what the term secularization means, right? Okay, so yeah, even even Stark, right, the biggest critics of and his ilk, the biggest critics of secularization, basically agree on this basic fact, right? There are social changes associated with modernity that have impacted religion, right? We're not in the same world that we were in 1900 or in 1850 or in 1642, right? The role of religion in society has definitely changed. And so what Marc Chavez sort of focuses on in terms of what is secularization is he says secularization isn't so much a decline in subjective individual belief, though it could be that, but more it is a change in religious authority, right? The role that religion plays in society. Now, does that mean that modernity is synonymous with religious decline, or has religion changed in its character as society changed in character as well, right? Is it a sort of dialectic, right? Society changes, religion changes, and therefore maybe what we thought of as, religion before is now something a little bit different and more suited to modernity, right? And I think this is a recognition by Chavez and by others in this camp. And, there's lots of people in this camp. Christian Smith, definitely, and I love Christian a lot, is in this camp as well, right? He's a kind of revised secularization theorist. But basically, right, it's clear that modernity isn't necessarily toxic to religion. That actually religions can thrive and expand in modernity, right? And we have all sorts of examples of this, right? Mormonism is essentially born in modernity, right? It doesn't exist prior to modernity. It's born in modernity and it thrives in modernity, right? Arguably, Christianity's massively expanded its global reach through the period of modernity and done really well. Islam has become more intense during the period of modernity also, right? And it's spread out quite a bit. And so modernity, doesn't necessarily have to be toxic to religion. It's sort of this admission that Chavez and all the revised scholars will sort of, admit to. It's like this notion that modernity is toxic to religion is probably wrong. Does it cause some problems for religion that religion then has to address? Definitely. Does it change the place of religion in society? Almost certainly, right? Because the society isn't the same, right? It's a much more complex, much more bureaucratized, much more rationalized society. And so religion has to find its place within that. So modernity is not toxic to religion, but the scope of religion in modernity is going to be different than it was in, pre-modernity, in the Middle Ages, right? In the Renaissance and all those different time periods. Okay. So, basically Chavez kind of goes back to Parsons and Bella, and kind of looks at some of the things that they said, particularly that, secularization is part of the increasing in social complexity, and that religion inherently becomes more of a private matter in modernity. Why? Right? Because it doesn't need to have the central place in society. The state starts to take this over, again, with the growth of the nation state, starting in the 17th century. The state starts to take on more and more of the roles that the church used to have. And again, this is not necessarily a negative change, right? It's just sort of a natural evolution of society. And, religion's role was this, and now it's that. It's not like, society's gotten worse. It's just a change, right? So very neutral kind of sociology-ish type language. In modernity, right, one of the things that kind of Chavez will suggest, and Parsons, and coming again from Parsons and Bella, is that people increasingly, right, because you have pluralism, people choose their own beliefs instead of being indoctrinated kind of socially into a set of religious beliefs. But this might actually be good for religion in some ways. Why? Because a religion that's chosen, right, if you choose your own religious beliefs, it is likely to be more important to you than something that was simply handed down to you, right? And this is why if you've ever met someone who, say, converted to Catholicism or to Islam, right, they are the most, or any other religion, doesn't matter. They're the most fervent believers in that thing, right? Almost to the point where you can't talk to them because it's just like they believe in it so intensely because they chose it. Yeah, Maya.
Would this be kind of like a functionalist perspective of religion? Because religion is filling a new function in society?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And I think, both Parsons and Bella are both functionalists at their kind of core. So yeah, I think that's a fair reading of that. Yeah, Jessica.
Would you even make the argument that people thought, and I'm talking not the sociologists, but the average people who engage with religion, think religion is dying and changing, or dying or going more obscure, more because it's simply changing, so it's not the same as it was when they joined. It's more pluralistic. It's more individual based.
And its place in society is deprecated, right? It used to be that if the Archbishop of Edmonton put out a statement saying, this is the right moral path, everyone cared. He does so regularly now, and I bet you no one even notices that isn't, deeply paying attention to it, right? So yeah, it might seem like religion is, falling down because that role has changed and we're still sort of attuned to in the Middle Ages, the church ran everything, and our mentality hasn't kind of realized this social evolution. So I think that's a fair way of reading it. Yeah, in the West, Christian ideas will continue to have influence, according to Chavez, even though organized Christianity itself might be less important. Okay, yeah. So Parsons and Bella, if secularization is defined as a process by which religion decreases in importance and by which it has less influence on one's worldview and social behavior, Parsons and Bella would say that it's occurring, but it's progressing. Religion is progressing rather than dissolving. It's taking on a new social role, and I think that makes sense to me. Okay, so Chavez. What does Chavez basically say? So what I call revised secularization theory, sometimes also referred to as neo-secularization theory. Chavez says that secularization is definitely occurring, but he says it can occur in kind of three levels, right? It can occur on, I left the middle one out, but there's three basic levels of secularization according to Chavez. at the micro level, right? So in terms of individual belief, at the macro level in terms of societal beliefs. And then there's this sort of like middle zone that's called meso, or like you can spell it M-E-S-O or M-Z, or M-E-Z-S-O, level secularization. And I'll go through this, but this is where, religious institutions themselves start to secularize to some extent. So what Chavez says is that in the US, right, in the US, and to a lesser extent in Europe, what seems to be happening is not so much macro or micro level secularization, it's macro level secularization, right? So there's less religious authority, right? So people are less, like religious institutions play less of a central role in people's lives, but at the micro level, people still broadly believe in at least something, right? Now it might not be Christianity as traditionally defined, but they believe in some kind of, religious beliefs, supernatural beliefs, spiritual beliefs of some kind, right? Okay, so this is, I think this is fairly uncontroversial, right? We know that the Catholic Church or the Protestant churches don't run the institutions they used to run anymore, right? It's mostly run by the state, and church has become just one institution amongst many. And so, from basically, Chavez takes this concept of institutional differentiation from Wallace and our already well-known buddy Steve Bruce, and basically, right, say that what we're living now is institutional differentiation. Practices in the religious sphere have only indirect effects on other spheres such as business, politics, leisure, and education. Right? Instead of being kind of the overarching institution in society that runs everything and that coordinates a lot of the belief system and values and everything of the whole society, increasingly, religion is just one sphere amongst many, right? Basically, religion now sits in its own sphere and doesn't necessarily have massive influence on anything else. So religious institutions have limited or no influence on other spheres, right? Politics, right? It has some influence, but it's not like, if the Pope says something, immediately the government of the United States or Canada immediately jumps, right? It exists in its own sphere, and its influence on, say, politics or leisure or business is indirect at best. Okay, so macro level secularization. It's basically the decline of religion in the social sphere, right? Religion, which had been linked to other social institutions and often controlled them, no longer does, right? It used to physically run the schools, right? And who were, a lot of the people who taught in the schools? They were priests and nuns, right? Or clergy of some kind. Medical care is no longer directly under religious control, right? I think I told the story that when my mother was born, right, and she's not that old, she's born in 1952 in northern Alberta, all the staff at the hospital in Bonnyville were nuns, right? They were like, it wasn't like indirect. The church actually physically ran the hospital, right? That obviously is no longer the case. You might still have things like Covenant Health, right, which is sort of indirectly connected to the Catholic Church. So that runs the Grey Nuns and Misericordia hospitals in Edmonton and a bunch of long-term care centers. But it's not like it's directly like, okay, and the bishop, I know this because I've been to board meetings for Covenant Health. The Bishop of Edmonton is there, or the Archbishop Richard Smith is there, but he's not making the decisions, right? He's part of the board. He's not, controlling the board. So medical care, even in ostensibly Catholic institutions, is not technically the purview of religious organizations. It's independent more or less. So religious institutions have become one set of institutions amongst many rather than the dominant one. So at the big societal level, right, at the macro level, we have secularization because religion has been kind of pushed into one sphere rather than being the institution that runs everything. And the state has taken that role. Yeah, please.
Kind of wondering, so in the United States, they have like their very religious society, like subculture societies.
Yeah.
Would that be more meso? Because for them it's very intense, but for everyone around them it's like, talk to them.
Well, I think at the level of the society, though, like, they don't run everything, right? Like, even if you have, say, I don't know, you live in Alabama and people are very religious, right? There's still public schools that are separate from religion. There are still public hospitals, right? typically coordinated by the state, right? Or in some way, rather than, you need education or medical care, you go to the church, right? That's sort of what it means. So you can still have intense religious kind of identification and society and all sorts of things, but it's not the dominant institutions of society, right? It's just one amongst many. Okay, good. I don't want to do short shrift to I don't want to do short shrift to Chavez because it's important. Okay, so meso-level secularization basically refers to this kind of funny level of secularization that Chavez calls internal secularization. And basically, it is that religious institutions themselves start to take on a much more secular character, right? So, I mean, one of the things that Chavez points to is that a lot of, the universities that exist, especially in the United States, this is much more true than in Canada. A lot of the great universities in the US were founded by religious congregations, right? Basically for the purpose of that particular religious congregation, right? So if you look at Harvard, right, it was the Reformed Church, the Calvinists, that founded Harvard. Princeton or Yale is the Congregationalists, Princeton, Presbyterians. Duke is a Methodist university. Duke is great. I love Duke, A, because everyone who goes there is a sociopath. And B, they have this beautiful cathedral in the center of campus. It's absolutely gorgeous campus, which they tried to build to look like Princeton. So it's literally like the Minecraft version of Princeton, but again, filled with raving sociopaths. I only say this because their sports culture is insane, and they will literally chant hurtful slogans at other universities that come, and apparently this is a feature of Duke that's particular. I went to a basketball game the last time I was there where they were playing North Carolina State University, and the chant for the whole game, and they just chanted this over and over for 2.5 hours, was, "If you can't go to college, that's okay. I guess you can go to state," right? Basically saying North Carolina State University is not really a college. And they just chanted this for hours. And I was like, how? You guys are sociopaths. You're terrible people. Basketball, the Blue Devils are that's the team there, is a phenomenon of itself. Anyway, so, all these schools now are fully kind of secularized, right? They were founded for religious purposes. And all of them have, actually, I don't know if Notre Dame has a seminary, but all of the kind of, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Duke, all have seminaries attached, right? Harvard has Harvard Divinity, Yale Divinity, Princeton Theological Seminary, and Duke is Duke Methodist Seminary, I think. But those schools were founded to train clergy. Now they've been secularized and become these wider kind of college institutions. They don't make curriculum decisions based on, theological concerns. They now make them on kind of secular concerns. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, are there any Canadian examples?
So most of I'm trying to think, some of them in the Maritimes, you would find some very small colleges that were, sorry, I didn't mean to glare at you. I just sound, I'm like the dog in Up, and I'm like, squirrel, why is there noise there? If you say St. Francis Xavier, St. Mary's, St. Jerome's, which are all, ostensibly Catholic universities in the Maritimes, they essentially what is it? There's one at Western University, and now I can't the King's University at Western. All were founded by the Catholic Church, right? Ostensibly for religious reasons. And now they have a Catholic studies program, but it is the tiniest little thing as part of those colleges. The rest of it is a secular university.
So how would you evade that? Because we have St. Joseph's and St. Stephen's.
So those are affiliate colleges, right? Basically, I know this because I've worked at St. Joe's many times. And I still do. St. Joe's and St. Stephen's are affiliates, right? So they technically run independently, but they were invited by Henry Marshall Torrey, the first Alexander Rutherford, the first president of the U of A, to be kind of to help build the university. And so they were given a land grant on the university grounds, but they actually aren't part of the university. They function entirely separately. So yeah, please.
When I was preparing for the first midterm, I found that University of Toronto was founded by the Church of England.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, interesting. I didn't know that about University of Toronto. They still also have a whole bunch of like religious colleges there, Wycliffe and University of St. Michael's College. But those are more like almost like Princeton theological seminaries of University of Toronto. So yeah, U of T might be the one exception, right? Or maybe not the one exception, but an exception in Canada. Most of the other ones, especially in the West, are all created by the state, right? So, but I'd have to look at everyone in kind of Eastern Canada. Yeah, please.
What about Concordia? I thought that was.
It's Lutheran.
Oh.
You mean here or the one in Montreal?
One here.
Oh yeah, so
I thought it was something.
yeah, Concordia, it was a Lutheran seminary, and then it sort of branched into becoming a community college, and now it's actually an interesting example of that, because it has like basically kicked the Lutherans out entirely and said, go away, Lutherans, because the Lutheran Church fundamentally doesn't have the money to fund it anymore, right? So they've now become, a kind of community college kind of model. I say that, they probably would be mad at me for saying that, because yes, they are a university. I mean, you can literally walk from one end to the other in like 5 minutes. So I don't know about that. But a university needs to be big enough that my legs hurt by the end of the day. They schedule my classes all over. Oh, I'm running out of time again. Okay. Okay, one other example I did want to put out here. University of Notre Dame is an interesting one. It's in Indiana. It is a Catholic university. The president of the university is still a Catholic priest. However, one of the things I find interesting, there's a story that came out of UND a few years ago. And basically, one of the very Catholic student groups at UND said, wrote a letter to the Board of Governors, and they said, this is a Catholic university, right? It's run by priests, right? There's a whole order of priests and nuns that basically exist to serve the University of Notre Dame. And they're like, one of the things we would really like this Catholic university to do is block pornography on the university's internet system. This went to the board voted on it, and they turned the proposal down, right? They said the University of Notre Dame is not going to get involved in, censoring pornography, even though, pornography is seen as gravely evil in Roman Catholicism. So again, it's like, University of Notre Dame, still ostensibly kind of Catholic, but at the level of the decisions they make, they're pretty much, I don't know if they were afraid that none of the football players would come to play at Notre Dame if the porn was blocked. I don't know what the basis of the decision was, but they made an administrative decision not on Catholic grounds, but on kind of practical grounds. Yeah, please.
Maybe make the argument that didn't do the block because they could, like for educational material, because I know in like my gender studies class we weren't talking about porn, in like a philosophy class we were talking about it. So it's almost the idea of you don't want to cut off knowledge or potential for the professors to use examples or course material. They didn't show like explicit. Let me clarify.
Oh no, I see. I've seen the syllabus for that class, not the one you're talking about, but the class where they show explicit material at University of Calgary. There's a professor that teaches porn studies, and it's a very odd class. It certainly exists, so I'm familiar with what you're talking about. Yeah, I mean, I don't remember like. Basically, they turned it down. I think on the grounds that they weren't going to police student morality was more the thing. But Catholic, maybe they should. The church is all about policing morality, right? That's sort of the church's deal. Anyway, this is an example, right? Okay. Most hospitals today, when we talk about meso-level secularization, they still broadly, now today, they operate broadly on administrative principles, right? With maybe some kind of, position that's quasi-religious or religious thrown in, but most of the operation isn't run by the church or any particular church, right? Catholic hospitals, walk a tightrope between social values and religious belief, while still kind of accepting that, some things that they might not like are going to be done in Catholic hospitals. I had a clip here. It's kind of a jokey one from The Simpsons, but I'm actually going to skip it. You can watch it yourselves. Just about how where Yale makes its decisions, right? It's now on broadly secular values. Okay, and micro-level secularization, primarily a reflection of how people's religious beliefs affect their daily lives. what's the role of religion in decision making, right? So Chavez says that, in terms of belief, most people still believe in something. But even at that level, he thinks there has been some secularization on this micro level. And I think one of the best examples of this that I can think of is, say, amongst Roman Catholics, even practicing Roman Catholics, right? The Roman Catholic Church, ever since forever, but really reaffirmed in a 1963 document called Humanae Vitae, has had a strong prohibition against the use of artificial contraception, right? So you can't use birth control of any kind, really, that's artificial. There's exceptions for things like what's called natural family planning, but best not to delve too deeply into that. Now, if you look at the statistics and when people have been polled, it's something like 95% of practicing Catholics have used, adult practicing Catholics who are married, have used contraception at some point in their lives, right? So what basis are people making their decisions on? In this sense, not on, religious beliefs, because the Catholic Church is really, really clear about what it believes on contraception. But Catholics are making the decisions principally based on practicality, right? On what works for their lives, on what works for their careers, on how they want to manage their families, how many children they want to have, rather than, the church says we should be open to life at all times. And that's what, people then go on and do, and have, lots of children. I mean, I do know a few really Roman Catholic people. I've one, not a friend, but an acquaintance. And I think, like, in this day and age, it's unthinkable. He has like 11 children. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, how do you move them from place to place? Like, just practically. A bus, like a small bus? Yeah, like, because I'm like, even like I guess you could like get a 15 passenger van, and I'm like, what's
very creepy.
yeah. Anyway, it's just like there's practical concerns. I'm like, once you go beyond like 5, you can't fit them into a minivan anymore. You got to go like industrial. Anyway, the point, right? I'm thinking on practical grounds, not on religious grounds. Clearly, okay. The grad students in the CCR have a pet mouse. They feed it. They're not helpful. Yeah, please.
Just kind of going back to the argument for birth control, could you even argue that it's becoming more practical because there are some health benefits? Like, oh god, it's like this.
Oh, for sure. Like,
Yeah.
but I think like even there, you're now like not thinking like someone who's like super Roman Catholic. You're thinking like someone who's like, well, my concern is my health, my career, my personal fulfillment. You're not like, I'm listening to the Roman Catholic Church that says be open to life at all times, right?
It's not more like, oh, we have more information on this, therefore our opinions change. It's more like, well, I like.
What do I want?
Yeah, because it's like if your period goes for too long, they'll put you on birth control to help subsidize it.
Yeah, but that's again a medical question where the Catholic Church has its opinions on this as well, which we won't get into too much. You had a friend from a religious family who had 11 siblings. Oh man, I have 3 kids and they fight all the time. I can't imagine what 11 would be like. All right, are we out of time? We're out of time. Oh, okay. But I had 2 left.
So I'm kind of tacking this on a little bit.
I have a recording on that slide apparently. All right, I'm going to clear that for next time. All right, we'll finish. We have 2 slides left for secularization on Monday, and then we're going to start in on the rise of Christianity. All righty. Okay.